Greetings, welcome to the Metal Book Tavern. In this video, I'm going to talk about my favorite books of all time. So I have already made this kind of videos. I remember that one of my early videos on my Now Russian channel was about my favorite books. And then I made a remake of that video, and I called it Honest Remake. Now I decided to update that video because some books were now out of that list. I still love them, but they're not my all-time favorites, as I thought they were. On the other hand, there were books that I read and loved, new books, and some of the old books that I realized were my favorites. A book I read doesn't instantly become my favorite, doesn't always happen. And like the previous video, this video is going to be in two parts because the first part is about the books published in Russian and the second about books in English, with one exception. If there's going to be at least 5 books that are going to be my favorites, be it new books or old books that I realized were my favorites, I'm going to make a separate video about them. So let's get started. About some of these books I already have why it's worth reading videos. I recommend checking these out. So the very first book in my hand is Beneath the Wheel by Hermann Hesse. This is the story of a guy who does nothing but study, and literally has no life outside of studying. And this is a great example of what the whole study thing does to kids, and I think it's done wonderfully. If you want to know more, I recommend checking out my review of this book. It's why it's worth reading, episode 3, Beneath the Wheel. Next book is 1984 by George Orwell. A lot has been said about this book. I'm not going to add more. I'm just going to say that the characters, they do feel very human to me. I like that despite the setting, despite what happens to them, there's still something human in this book. And yes, this book is full of interesting ideas and thoughts that can be implemented in real life, and you can always remember this book. It's quite hard to forget. It's very relevant. It's very frightening at some point. And I think everyone should read this book at least once. When I'm going to have a series in this video, I'm only going to show the first book. So the next book is actually series, and that's the series that turned my life upside down. I absolutely fell in love with this series, and I mentioned that many times, and this is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. This is the first book, A Game of Thrones. I also have the English version, but I decided to go with the Russian version for this video because I like the cover and I like the edition itself. So this showed people to me in a very different way. I absolutely love how different people are in this book. It's often said that George R.R. Martin's characters are morally gray. Wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Characters in George R.R. Martin's books are all colors of the spectrum. You have neutral characters, you have more good than bad characters, you had absolutely good characters, and vice versa. I love how different are the characters in his books, and the dialogue. The dialogue is definitely the strongest aspect of A Song of Ice and Fire. So now, after all the hype around the show and the series in general is left behind, I am ready to go back to Westeros, and I want to read this book in English, and I would like to see these books anew in a very chill environment. I mean that in an environment that it's free of all the hype. Yeah, I was such a huge fan. Definitely I should make a video on how I was obsessed with these books. Next comes the book that I found in the library. I just loved the edition. It stood out, and I'm glad that it did. I loved it, and I got myself my own copy, and that's 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Yes, this book has no chapters. Yes, there are 2 names for nearly every male character in the book. Nonetheless, this book is very interesting to read all the same. It is very charming, and it's very interesting to observe the different generations of the Buendia family. A little bit dark and still charming. I love it. Read it in 2014 and still my favorites. Next one is a recent favorite. I recorded my all-time favorite books honest remake before I read this book, and I absolutely loved it, and I just went through it a year later, and yes, definitely my favorite. The Neverending Story by Michael Ende. I have a review on my channel, why it's worth reading. The Neverending Story, episode 2. I talk about this book and why it's worth reading. I recommend checking that one out. The Neverending Story stands out for me because it does a good job combining your standard fantasy quest with all your standard go there, bring this, fight this guy, with your standard fantasy setting and your standard fantasy creatures, and a lot of philosophical and moral questions. Yes, this book is very philosophical. Yeah, pure power metal energy in here. Not in Tolkien's books here, because of this combination, because we love good fantasy fun side and deep philosophical questions. Next comes the books that shocked me. I read it online. I was horrified at the teachers, at the adults in this book, but I loved the book all the same. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. And no, I only loved the first book. I haven't read the rest of the series. You know, when you read this book, you feel sorry for Ender, you feel mad at the teachers, and when you read this, you also feel sorry for other kids. At the same time, it's also a very thrilling story, very interesting, very good dynamics, very good setting and building, and it's a good quest. Yeah, this book can be brutal at times, and it's still touching all the same. That's what matters. Next book I read in August 2021. I bought this book in Moscow, where I read it, liked it, and I didn't think much of it. But recently, I often picked up this book from my shelves. I went through a few moments. I went through nearly entire book, and I understood that this is one of my all-time favorite novels, or to be exact, biographies. I love it. I Am Ozzy by Ozzy Osbourne. So in here you have Ozzy's biography. He starts with his childhood in Aston, Birmingham. This book came out in 2009. So this book leads from his childhood up to that point. This story is both tragic and fun. There are a lot of tragic moments from Ozzy's life. Yes, he's a wild rock star. He leads a wild rock and roll lifestyle with all the substance abuse and lots of women and blah blah blah. But at the same time, when you read this book, you realize that despite leading such lifestyle, Ozzy Osbourne is a quite intelligent guy. When you read this, you think, wow, this guy actually does quite a good job expressing his thoughts, and he does understand a lot of things. Also, this is a very sincere biography. Ozzy doesn't shy away from all the dark moments of his life. So this one is a very bright biography. Once you read it, you'd want to read this again. Finally, the last book in Russian. For now, there's going to be one more, but in the end. I recently made a video, why it's worth reading series, book number 4. Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I just love Narnia so much. I will defend these books. I will defend this series. Fantasy fans mostly prefer other fantasy books and often leave Narnia out. If you want to know more, why it's worth reading, episode 4, Chronicles of Narnia. I recommend watching that one. Now it's time for books in English. So the very first book is Until Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I remember reading it in Russian in summer 2020 and I loved it. And I'd love rereading it. A good detective story is able to keep me awake at 5 a.m. p.m. Sorry, I often confuse these. Well, either way, you got the point. A good detective story, it won't let me go. But the deal is that most detective stories, once you know the plot twist, they fade from mind. This one I definitely would reread again, even though I know everything what happens. Who was behind this. I still love rereading this because I like the characters, I like the story, and I love how everyone has his or her skeleton in the closet, and I like the dynamics, I love what they do, and yeah, definitely one of my favorites. I'd love to read this again, but not in English. I prefer the Russian translation. It's simply better. Next we have The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So I read the 4 dystopian novels, I read 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, Fahrenheit 454, and Brave New World. I can say that the 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale are my all-time favorites. There is something about the book that catches my eye. I read this 3 times, 2 times in Russian, once in English, and I want to read this book again. Also, one fact, when I was making the Russian version of this video, I showed the Russian copy of the book, and I said that I don't know in which language I'm going to read this book, but now when I'm holding this copy and go through the pages, I think I should read this in English again. I'd always love to go back to Gilead, despite it being a dark place. Yeah, I do love stories with dark settings, dark places. Well, except Narnia, it's not that dark. So the next book is Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is one of 3 separate stories from the Silmarillion. So from the Silmarillion we have Beren and Luthien, Children and Húrin, and The Fall of Gondolin. So I reread the Silmarillion in January 2020, and I absolutely loved Beren and Luthien. To be honest, one of the reasons I loved the story was because Luthien turned out to be cooler than I remembered. Yeah, she's definitely very cool. I'd say that Luthien is an inspiration for me. I have been postponing saying that, and I'm going to say this. This inspired me to write my own novel. Here you have a story of an elvish princess Luthien and a mortal human being Beren. And the story goes they met each other, they fell in love, the world was against them being together, but they made it through, blah 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 blah. Yes, it sounds kinda generic on the surface, but it's touching. And Luthien is actually a very cool character, especially in this version. I prefer this version to the official Silmarillion version, because here Luthien is actually called Tinuviel, and there are a lot of differences also, other than the names, is that Darion is her brother instead of a potential husband in the original version, and the way Luthien meets Huan is different. And what's most important, here you have an amazing character called Tevildo, Prince of Cats. Allow me to show you oh yeah, I found it. Here's Luthien and Tevildo. It's so bad that he isn't in the Silmarillion, because this is such an inspiration for me, that's why it's one of my favorites, although I avoided going back to Beren and Luthien while I was writing the book, because I wanted my story to be separate from Beren and Luthien as much as possible, and in the end of the day there are almost no similarities except a few. So the next one is my recent read, one of my recent reads, and that's Misery by Stephen King. This was one of the 5 books that I definitely had planned for 2023. I planned them at the end of the last year, and finally I read this, and kudos to Stephen King. This is the first Stephen King book that actually scared me. I was legit terrified. So here is how I read this book. I read around 25 pages, closed the book, and then I went back to the book the next day, and it goes on and on. But by the end I was like, nah, I'm going to read more than 25 pages. Yeah, definitely a very scary story. It scared me a lot, and I'm afraid to reread this, but I'd love to read this at some point. Also, in this book I also had a very interesting experiment, because I added some notes. I sort of annotated this book. The deal is that it has sticky notes inside because I didn't want to ruin the book. In some moments I shortened the sticky notes. It's definitely scary, and you can't put this down. Even if you feel like you need to take a break, you still go back to this book, and you know you have to read this, and you are going to love it. So the next book is a series, and this is the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. I won't say much about Harry Potter because everyone knows these books and a lot of people love them. and I absolutely adore them too. I'm just going to say that I'm currently reading the third one, and I need to get books 4 and 7. To be honest, now I realized that I was mostly a fan of the films back in the day. Sure, I read the books and I love them, but to me, Harry Potter, especially the later films, are more associated, with the films. Especially the later installments are more associated with the films rather than the books. And I remember that I read a lot the first 3 ones, and not so much the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th one, especially for books 4 and 5. And now I want to go back to the series in a book form. I want to read the whole series. Next is the book that I realized is my favorite right before I sat down to film the video. I filmed the Russian version of this video first. I went through a few pages. I realized that this is definitely one of my favorites. On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is a great essay about why escapism matters, why fantasy matters, and how you have to learn to separate escapism from real life, how they're bound together, and how human mind is capable of imagination and things like that. I will want to make a separate video regarding On Fairy Stories, and it's not a why it's worth reading episode, it's about something else. A video essay, sort of, a podcast. But it's definitely a good essay on why fairy stories matter. So the next book I read last spring, it was in May 2022. I read it around the time I had a strong reading slump. I couldn't read anything. This book literally saved me. And now when I go back to it, it's definitely one of my favorites. And this is A History of Heavy Metal by Andrew O'Neill. I think all metalheads should read this at least once. Definitely, it's a good gift for a metalhead. You can read this as a beginner metalhead, or you can read it as an advanced metalhead as well. I have a separate video about this book. It's a 10-minute video when I talk about it, and it's not a why it's worth reading episode, although I think it should have been. I didn't think much about that, and definitely if you are a heavy metal fan, you definitely should read this. Definitely a good thing for metalheads. So the next book is, I think, my favorite bands for introducing this series to me, and this is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Yeah, I know, the King Killer Chronicle series, but I love predominantly the first one, The Name of the Wind. The second one, not so much. Yeah, sure, good book, and I suppose the second reread is going to have a different impression. It's going to leave a different impression on me, but I love the first one because I love the sense of adventure, the autumn atmosphere, all the taverns, all the music, and some really dark spooky moments, and then you have this university, and by the end of the book there's a climax. The main character Quoth proves himself to be a hero. Yeah, maybe a little bit controversial hero, but a hero nonetheless, and I just love this atmosphere. And given the fact that I read the book in English, I definitely can say that Patrick Rothfuss selected quite a lot of beautiful words. Okay, so that video was filmed at the end of March, and after I filmed that video, I realized that Apt Pupil from Different Seasons by Stephen King is one of my all-time favorite books. I think of that novella quite often. It's a very good novella about a boy who discovers that his neighbor is a runaway Nazi, and Stephen King does show madness in that boy very well. I also watched the film adaptation and I liked it, although the film didn't depict Todd's madness as much as the book did, and this is why the book is better. So Different Seasons in general is quite a good collection of 4 short stories. Well, I haven't read the 4th one yet, to be honest, but either way, it's still an amazing collection. And I definitely recommend reading Apt Pupil because it's very good, but I also warn you that this is also very shocking novella in a way that it depicts falling into madness. Be careful. What an amazing novella, one of the best things Stephen King has ever written. And finally, the book that I saved to last, because when I think of my all-time favorite books, this is the book that comes to my mind first. This is my comfort fiction. This is the book that my edition says you can live there. And I opened this book during the darkest times. This is a good escape for me. It uplifts me and I love it so much. And this is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. This book is definitely the first episode of Why It's Worth Reading. It's on my channel. I recommend checking that one out. And I love the characters, I love the atmosphere, I love the writing style, and I can open the book at any moment and I can rejoice because it's so good. Alright, that's all. These are my all-time favorite books. What are your favorite books? Let me know down in the comments. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Goodbye.